Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. Today I'm gonna show you 3 creative ways to use Ableton Meld that will hopefully inspire you. Let's jump into Ableton. Alright, so I have Ableton Meld default and I also add the Ableton default reverb. We're gonna use F3 as legato note like this, remove oscillator B, bring down 3 octave. We're gonna bring the shape at 34 and tone at 57 to have this kind of buzzy square. Then change the filter to a low pass 12 dB MS to bring it down the frequency, bring up a bit the Q and the drive. And I'm gonna open up here the matrix section and we're gonna go to the LFO section. And this is our first tip. One of the great things with Meld is that in the LFO shape you have a Euclidean mode, which is way much more rhythmical, way much more like pattern like sequencing style of modulation. And to hear the effect we need to first map obviously the LFO one different parameter. So here I've mapped it to oscillator 1 macro, oscillator 2 macro, the filter and also the general volume here, so you can hear the effect better. So by default it sounds like this. You can hear it's pulsating quite slowly. You can control the rate. I'm gonna put it in sync. Maybe we're gonna go at 116. And then you can really start to use step and pulse to kind of create your own rhythmical sequence. Now you might need to double check with the kick drum depending the groove you want. What I like to do is actually to use LFO2 to either modulate step or pulse because they will alternate this groove. So create even a more complex rhythm. So here I'm gonna decide to modulate the pulse, LFO1 to macro, and we're gonna go 100%. And then you can adjust, again I'm gonna put in sync. And you can really like tweak until you find a rhythm you like. I'm gonna put it in the trigger as well here as well. And now if you wanna go even further, you can decide to use LFO1 FX to modulate the rate of LFO2. Therefore you will have LFO1 FX modulating LFO2 rate, which modulate LFO1 pulse, which modulate all of your parameter. Because basically LFO1 and LFO1 FX, they are independent. You see on the modulation, both they have their own modulation mapping, and any change you make to LFO1 FX doesn't affect LFO1. So we can create a new waveform here based on LFO1 to modulate LFO2 rate. So LFO1 FX, LFO2 rate, maybe here we can go negatively 20. And then here again, it's quite a lot about experimenting until you find a groove you like. And then maybe we can use this scrambler, which is basically depending the value is gonna completely change the waveform, making something very weird. So again, you can try different until you find the one you like. Now, if we play with the kilogram, now what can happen sometimes is like the rhythm feel a bit off, so you can still use the offset to kind of shift the step like you would do in a sequencer. Here it was perfect how it was. You see if I shift the offset it doesn't sound great, but this is something that can be useful sometimes. Now here I'm gonna add a bit of ping pong delay. But also as it's more bass sound, I'm gonna add a sidechain to get a pumping effect. If you wanna find out more about this sidechain rack, I put the link in the description. And finally, I'm gonna use AQ8 as a kind of a low pass filter. So I get a more bassy sound, and now with the kick, I got this nice bassy groove on top of my rumble. Now, obviously, this kind of rhythm could be achieved with a step sequencer or even the Ableton Euclidean MIDI generator. But here is a nice kind of generative way to do it with parameter, and you can also map this to both oscillator macros, to the filter. So here another example with pretty much the same matrix modulation, the same engine, just different rhythm with the Euclidean and the LFOs, pretty much the same effect chain, and you got. And here another example as well where you have the LFO1 FX actually modulating the filter, but you also have LFO2 modulating the filter. So you have two different modulation modulating the same parameter, which also give a nice groove. Again, same effect with delay and sidechain, and with the kick. So yeah, definitely a cool trick to look into if you want to have a very rhythmical synth, which is usually great for techno. Here I use it on bass, but you can use it on synth, on more percussive style of sound, maybe a stab, or yeah, really great feature to experiment with. Alright, for our next tips, I'm gonna show you creative way to use some of the weirdest Meld filter, like for example the phaser, the comp, the plate resonator. These are filters that are sometimes very hard to get a nice sound out of it because they are obviously very particular. One way I found is to actually use kind of noisy oscillator into this type of filter. It's working really well. So here I've set to crackle, and I'm gonna reduce the frequency so we can start to hear something. Add a bit of Q to get this metallic tone. We can get ratio at 100. Now, with noise, I like to stack them and to use the spread, so you get a more stereo sound. Now, you can hear if I change the position of the frequency filter, the pitch is changing. So the idea is to actually do some key tracking on the filter. So like this, the higher the note you play, the higher the pitch, the lower the note you play, the lower the frequency. So you go to MIDI and you set the pitch modulating the filter to 100. And now I have my crackle, which is can play different note. Now you can set the frequency until you find frequency or tone you like. But let's say, for example, you want to stay in the key of your track. There is one thing with Meld is that you have this scale awareness parameter, which will follow the scale you are in. If you check here up there, you have to make sure in the settings also the filter is in scale awareness. And now you can play stuff which are in key of your track. Now I use crackle, but you can try different, like for example, filter noise. If you're not really good at chord like me, you can use new Ableton expressive chord and pitch it up here. Now if you want more weirdness, maybe do something. A different parameter here. So you get more weird note. And this can be great for ambience, like for example if you crank up the decay and the dry wet of your reverb. Now here, after a bit of tweaking, I changed to the comp filter and I apply LFO1 on oscillator 1 macro, and you can get some pretty melodic. So do not hesitate to change this kind of weird filter and really experimenting with different oscillator noise, different type of filter, always having the key tracking if you want to be in key, and you can get very weird result. Here, for example, I'm using the phaser, but again, key is mapped to the filter, and here I have also LFO1 modulating the volume, but yeah, with crackle and bubble here. So I have on one side this kind of yeah, just to show you can get different tone with experimenting with different noise and different weird resonator or phasing filter. Now last tip is a quick one, but one thing that happened to me is like Meld is very overwhelming because you have two oscillators which each have this its own envelope, LFO, filter, you have this huge matrix, and yeah, you can kind of feel very discouraging to use it because of that. So what I like to use is to usually design my classic sound just with one oscillator and just not pay attention to the second one. So here I'm just using the oscillator B to create this kind of raised kind of sound. And that's where I'm gonna bring oscillator A with a weird tone. So you can always link the envelope, which is pretty handy if you don't want to copy everything. You can also copy all the metrics from one to another with here. So that can be very handy if you wanna have two oscillators following the same modulation and same envelope. And then just select one of the weird tone. Like for example here I use extra tone, which sound like this with a phaser. And then when I layer with the other one, and then after I add a bit of effect, multiband distortion with raw, a bit of EQ. This is auto filter just in case I need to do some modulation, and finally a bit of reverb. So yeah, that's one simple but quite effective. Really like just focusing on one oscillator to have your bread and butter sound, and then using the second oscillator maybe with a more weirder oscillator, a little bit different filter to just add this little extra excitement to your original sound, just to make it slightly a bit more interesting. Alright, thank you very much for watching. If you wanna support me, you can grab this project on my Patreon. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next time. Bye bye.